anytime you're looking at either installing a new septic system or a replacement, the first thing that's going to need to be done is a perk test. And what that is usually in coordination with your local health department. What we're looking at is the soil type in the ground. Each county, at least in Michigan, and it's different. Some states have a statewide sanitary code. So depending on where you're at, there may be a local county that has requirements, or some of them are statewide. But what we're looking at is typically between 12 to 15 feet deep in the ground. So what we need to find is a good sharp sand. And what that sand looks like, because there are different types of sand. And I can just had yesterday a customer, they have a sandy soil, but it's a fine sand. And what happens with that fine sand is it gets very compacted, and it's some of the worst soil that we deal with when we're trying to dig up septic tanks, because it gets hard as a rock. And when we're trying to probe, we've got a rod that we probe the ground to locate the tank and lay out and try to find the lids. When you're probing, when you pull the probe back out, that sand just fills in that hole. So you have a really hard time getting through the ground with a probe. So it makes it very difficult. But as far as septic systems go and drain fields, that type of sand, that fine sand, is not good for drainage, because it gets compacted, and then at that point it doesn't allow the water to drain through it at a rate that it's acceptable for getting rid of the water that's coming out of the septic tank. So we're looking for a coarse sand. So it's almost going to look gravelly, so kind of real small pebbles mixed in with the sand. If you've ever seen that type of sand, that's perfect sand for drainage. That's ideally what we're looking for. And again, codes are going to vary throughout the country, but our local code calls for at least 4 feet of sand beneath the drain field. So the perk test is going to involve a machine coming out, backhoe or an excavator, and we're going to start digging. And the inspector from the health department will be watching, and as we go down into the ground, we're going to see different layers of soil, because typically you're going to find topsoil at the surface. So you might find 6 to 12 inches of topsoil, and then you might get into some clay, and then once you get through that, once we hit that good coarse sand that we're looking for, then we're going to need to go down another 4 feet to make sure that there's an adequate amount of sand for that treatment below the septic system, and that there's going to be proper space for that water to drain away. And then we also want to make sure that there's no seasonal high water table in the area. So we'll get back to that when we get to the engineered systems, but the high water in the ground can cause a problem with conventional installations of the drain field. So again, we're looking for 2 things. We want to make sure that the drain field is not too deep in the ground. Most of the counties in our area call for no more than 24 to 30 inches of cover on top of the drain field. And the reason for that is we want it close enough to the surface so that it can get oxygen from the surface. We've talked a little bit before in some other videos about aerobic versus anaerobic bacteria. We want to get good aerobic bacteria growth in the drain field, and to allow that to happen, we want to make sure that we're getting oxygen from the surface, so that bacteria can be in an aerobic state as opposed to an anaerobic state. So we want to be close enough to the surface with our drain field, hit that good coarse sand so we have good drainage, and have at least 4 feet of sand below it. So once the perk test is done, that's really going to give the contractor the requirements that are needed to give a bid on the replacement or the original installation. We're going to know things like how much sand we need to bring in. Because if let's say there's 5 feet of clay on the top, the top layer of soil, and then we hit that good 4 feet of sand below that, that clay on top has to be removed, and then we need to bring in more coarse sand so that we can get the insulation layer of the drain field close enough to the surface so we meet that requirement. So the perk test will give us the requirements for how much trucking of material in and out that we're going to have, as well as size of the system, whether it's going to be a conventional or an engineered installation, and then any tank size requirements, and all of those items will be listed once the perk test is done. And typically, once the perk test is done, that's the first requirement in the permitting process. And once the perk test is done, we can go ahead and give a bid. And once we know at that point that what the requirements are.